This new speaker line is beating the competition like a drum. But does this little Elac outperform its bigger brother? You might be surprised. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk about the new Elac Debut 3, the 5 1/4 inch version, versus its bigger brother, the 6 1/2 inch version. Okay, so this is the Elac Debut 3.0, the 5 1/4 inch version. Let's do the woofer tap test. Oh yeah. It is the DB53-BK. I think it only comes in black. I don't really know why they need the -BK, unless maybe they're planning on coming out with some different colorways. If you saw my video on its bigger brother, I was really impressed. I think a lot of people have been impressed with the new Elac Debut 3. A bit of a departure from the Elac Debut 2nd generation, and I like this better because the 1st generation, warm, robust, large sounding. The 2nd generation, it was a little bit mid-rangey for me. Not nearly as punchy. However, I did like the 2nd generation 5 1/4 inch version. And there's been a bit of a theme for me because a lot of times I like the 5 1/4 inch version of a speaker better than the 6 1/2 inch version of a speaker, and definitely was the case with the previous generation. Spec-wise, this comes with the same 1-inch aluminum dome tweeter as the bigger brother, the 6 1/2 inch version. This is a 5 1/4 inch 3rd generation aramid fiber cone woofer. Frequency response from 48 Hertz on the bottom end up to 38,000 Hertz. Impedance 6 ohms, sensitivity 86 1/2. Looks like it's about 1.5 inches shorter, maybe an inch less deep than the 6 1/2 inch version. Same magnetic grills, same pretty cool wood grain looking vinyl wrap. Weighs in at 13.34 pounds. That's oddly, extremely, very specific. 3-year warranty. Let's check out the 6 1/2 inch version. I should also note that the 5 1/4 inch version is coming in at $100 cheaper than its bigger brother. So $349 for the little guy, $450 for the larger one, and that is only a $50 increase over, actually I don't even think this one's a $50 increase, only a $50 increase as far as MSRP, the 6 1/2 inch version from the previous generation, if you follow that. Alright, frequency response for the bigger one, 42 up to 38,000 Hertz. So on paper, 48 for the little guy, 42 for the big guy. 6 ohm nominal impedance, 87 dB. So the big ones are a 0.5 dB more efficient. In efficiency, if you're new, broad strokes means what it's going to sound like as far as loudness, SPL, at 1 meter at 1 watt. Now, music is very dynamic, so a lot of times if there's a big bass hit, it's going to suck a lot of that power out. So don't think you're going to get 87 dB at 3 feet listening to music. Quite the contrary. Maybe if you're listening to a specific frequency, yes. But in most applications, we're not listening to a specific frequency, we're listening to a specific song. Either way, Elac, I think, is moving in the right direction by making their speakers ever so slightly more efficient generation over generation. And the 6 1/2 inch version comes in at a beefy 17.3 pounds. Just a smidge south of 4 pounds heavier. I had these hooked up in my living room to the Advanced Paris A10 Classic, which is a very nice, very expensive integrated amplifier. Wanted to put something nice on it to get the best out of these speakers. I was also running the Weem Ultra Streamer with a USB out into an SMSL P0100 as an outboard reclocker. If you missed that video, It stirred up a lot of emotions in people in the comments. I will link that at the end of this video. You should really check it out because it's a cheap way to make your Weem Ultra sound better. A caveat to that though is you need to be using the USB output on the Weem Ultra. Anyway, I have a whole video discussing it. But to my ears, much better sound than just running it into my DAC, which is a J2, the 4499 version from Just Shally Labs. I had the 5 1/4 inch version hooked up to speaker A, the 6 1/2 inch version hooked up to speaker B, and then I would switch it back and forth. Not ideal, I get it, but I don't have 2 of the same amps, I don't have 2 of the same DACs, and I don't have 2 of the same streamers, so I wanted things to be about as close as they could get. Of course, this is purely subjective, and if you would like to know what the measurements are, I have no idea. There's probably places out there where you can find the measurements on this speaker though. In a lot of cases, if somebody is looking to buy a speaker from a new line or an existing line, the prevailing thought process is to spend as much money as you can if you're looking at bookshelves and you can afford it, or even if it's a stretch, just get the 6 1/2 inch version because it's just bigger and better. That hasn't always been my experience. And almost invariably, I think the 5 1/4 inch versions sound quite different than the 6 1/2 inch versions. Definitely with Elac Debut 2.0, with the Polk ES15 versus the ES20. The Polk R100 versus R200, thought that sounded very different. And the Emotiva, the previous generation, the B1 Plus, sounded very different from the B2 Plus. So which one is better? Well, it depends on the track. First of all, I want to get one thing out of the way. Both of these speakers are spectacular in my opinion. And if I'm painting with broad strokes again, they're both a little bit rolled off on top. However, one of them seems a little bit more rolled off on top, and I don't think it has anything to do with the top end. I think it actually has a lot to do with the mid-range, the lower mid-range especially. If you leave, don't look back, something, off the Pretty in Pink soundtrack, okay? Probably not a great recording. Probably a little bit lacking in dynamics. I will say that that song sounded much better on the Elac Debut 3.0, the 6 1/2 inch version.
Winner!
But just wait, Hurt by Johnny Cash sounded better on the little ones.
Winner!
Now the reason why I think the 6 1/2 inch version sounded better with If You Leave off the Pretty in Pink soundtrack is because that song isn't very dynamic. So I was getting a little bit more bass punch. I was getting a little bit more body in the lower mid-range on that song than I was on the 5 1/4 inch version. However, Hurt by Johnny Cash I thought sounded better on the 5 1/4 inch version because that song is a bit more dynamic and Johnny Cash's voice is very baritone and full. And I think the 6 1/2 inch version just has a little bit too much oomph in the lower mid-range compared to the 5 1/4 inch version. So Hurt sounded better on the little brother. Of course, it could not be a speaker comparison without Alanis Morissette, which, by the way, she is getting ready to get retired because it comes up all of the time. The MTV Unplugged album sounded better on the little ones, all songs.
Winner!
I'm not exactly sure why. I just heard more air and more detail in the guitars, the percussion, her voice, especially breath sounds. Just heard more of it on the 5 1/4 inch version. Shoot to Thrill also sounded better in the little ones.
Winner!
The guitar comes out of the right speaker when it first comes in, the beginning of that song. Much more detailed, much cleaner, and also, I think, a little bit crispier in the guitar. Little 280 in the 6 1/2 inch version. Sunday, Bloody Sunday by U2. Sounded much better on the big 6 1/2 inch version.
Winner!
And I think that song, that recording, is very similar to If You Leave off the Pretty in Pink soundtrack, where it's not super dynamic. I just feel like those tracks, like if this is the bass, right there. If there is a remastered version of Sunday Bloody Sunday, please put it in the comments, because I love that song, but sometimes it gets a little grating. With the snare drum at the beginning, it just, I want more dynamics. The Way It Is by Bruce Hornsby and The Range. Don't forget about The Range. Sounded better on the big ones.
Winner.
And I think it's because there's a lot of percussion at the beginning. And again, I don't think that song is super dynamic, and it was just a little much on the 5¼ inch version. I was listening to these about 70 to 80 dB in the living room, and they got plenty loud. From a bass perspective, they were both very impressive, but I mean, the 6½ inch version just mops the floor with the 5¼ inch version as far as bass, the palpability, the impact. And one of the things I've always loved about Elac speakers, except for the debut 2nd generation, is they've always punched harder than they really have any right to do. And the 6½ inch version, I kind of feel like it can compete with a lot of floor standing speakers with multiple woofers. It just plays so much louder than it is. However, the 5¼ inch version is not embarrassed and reminds me a little bit of the PSB Imagine XBs, which was a small speaker 5¼ inch woofer that just absolutely thrilled me with the amount of bass. And I think if I wasn't comparing these two directly, I would be singing the praises of the bass on the 5¼ inch version, but it just cannot compete with its bigger brother. Not surprisingly, I prefer the 5¼ inch version, with the caveat that you have a subwoofer. If you don't have a subwoofer, you don't want to buy a subwoofer, then I think the 6½ inch version is the way to go. I feel like you're getting way more detail in the mid-range, more on the top end as well. And I don't think it's because of the top end. Like I said before, I think it's because there's just a little bit too much weight in the lower mid-range on the 6½ inch version. But even if you don't have a subwoofer, I think the little brothers will actually make most people happy as long as they don't have this one to compare it to. Really impressed with how much bass these put out. But if you don't have a subwoofer, these can get a little bit thin on the bottom with certain tracks. Both of these are a little bit rolled off compared to other speakers. The vocal tonality, the vocal realism, I think is a little bit better on the 5¼ inch version. More transparent and I think more true to the recording, if that makes sense. But both of these speakers are a lot of fun. The 6½ inch version plays a lot bigger. I just took the Super Lintons out, which is a 3-way, really big vintage style speaker. And the Big Brothers just provided a very similar largeness as far as the music. Both of them do a great job of soundstage, and that was one of the, key things about the first generation that really blew me away of the Elac Debut series. Just how big they play. Bigger brother plays bigger than little brother. If you're in the market and you're interested in either one of these speakers, I think which one you should get kind of depends on, well, obviously your budget, but also what type of music you listen to the most. If it's not super dynamic, go with the big ones. If it's a more dynamic, better recorded song, go with the little ones. But if you have an EQ, I think you can pull down probably 600 hertz-ish, maybe 400, 350, and you're gonna get the bigger one to kind of sound similar to the little one. If you bring up about 125 hertz, you're gonna get some of the impact, some of the bass punch from the little ones. If you're after super detailed top end air, then I don't think either one of these speakers is probably the best choice for that. You can look at the Emotiva XB2s. They come in around $500-ish, so they're going to be more expensive, $150 more expensive than the 5¼ inch version. But I think right now this speaker is, and it's at MSRP, I think right now this speaker is probably one of the best deals you can get. If you like this video, make sure you check out my video I just did on the $60 hi-fi hack for your Weem Ultra. It was a lot of fun to make, caused a lot of people's heads to spin off.